Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first session in our new series, Research Revisited. I'm Kirsty Shearman, Member Engagement and Development Manager at the Health Research Authority, and I'm going to be chairing the session this evening. We're here to explore the groundbreaking YouScreen study, the largest clinical trial looking at self-sampling for cervical screening. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Anita Lim, academic researcher on the YouScreen study, and Professor Paula McGee, former chair of the South Birmingham Research Ethics Committee, which reviewed the YouScreen study. We're going to revisit the journey of YouScreen from its rationale and design through to ethical review and confidentiality advice group review, and into the real-world impact that this research has had. So before we get going, just some general bits of housekeeping. We are recording this event for anyone who was unable to join us today, or those of you who might like to watch again in the future. Closed captions are enabled at the bottom on the Zoom toolbar. If you have any technical issues related to the webinar now, please contact the HRA engagement team using the email address engagement.team@hra.nhs.uk. We have allocated some time for questions and answers later in this webinar, and Q&A is enabled. So please use the Q&A button again on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom to submit any questions that you'd like to ask Anita and Paula as we go through the session tonight. And Will is going to kindly be coordinating those for us. Finally, we will be sharing a link to a short feedback form after this webinar, and we would really appreciate if you were to complete this to let us know your thoughts on what you've heard today and how you found this event. So that's everything from me, and without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anita now to tell us all about the YouScreen trial.
Thanks very much, Kirsty, and thanks so much for organising this event. I have to say that the YouScreen trial and the YouScreen project in general was a really epic journey for me and my research team, and it really changed me as a researcher and my approach to how I actually do this sort of work. So I'm really delighted to be able to share some of the details of that with you today, and also in particular how we interacted with the REC and the CAG were quite unique for us as a research team as well. So first of all, to set the scene, I'm just going to give you a quick potted history of the YouScreen trial. So we'll move to the next slide, please. So cervical cancer in general, so the cervix is located at the neck of the womb, and it's what connects the uterus to the vagina. So the first thing to know about cervical cancer is that it's highly preventable. So one of the key mechanisms by which how we prevent cervical cancer is by screening. The human papillomavirus causes almost all cervical cancers, and this is a virus that is spread via sexual contact. It's really, really common, and most people will have it in their lifetimes, and your body's immune system would normally just clear that by itself. But for some people, that doesn't happen. You get a persistent infection there, and then you can start to get some cell changes. Now, this is also an important fact because if you have a persistent infection and you get cell changes there, what we're looking for with cervical screening is to pick up those changes to stop them from developing into cancer. So in the UK, each year, we still get about 3,000 cases of cervical cancer, and we have see about 900 deaths per year. So as I've just mentioned, the aim of cervical screening is to detect and remove those high-grade cervical disease to prevent cancer from developing. And what we saw when we set out to do YouScreen was that in the last 20 years or more, screening attendance in this country and across the UK has been falling like that for the last 20 years, and we've not been able to get that back up. And this is really, really important because and underscreened women are at the highest risk of developing cervical cancer. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So the knowledge that the HPV virus actually causes cervical cancer led us to move from cytology testing, where we used to have a smear test, what we used to call a smear test, where you look at the cells under the microscope, to actually just testing for the HPV DNA. And this is what enables us to do self-sampling. So traditionally, you've got your smear test where you have a speculum examination. It's very intimate. And we know that this has been a key barrier for to stop people from coming for their screening test because people find it embarrassing, they find it painful, and sometimes there's cultural or religious reasons why people would not come for the test, and sometimes it's just about getting that appointment. So busy lifestyles. And with self-sampling, we know if you can do the test yourself with a simple swab, you're able to address quite a few screening barriers. We also knew at the time when we set out to design the study that had a really similar accuracy to clinician taken samples, so your usual standard screening test. And we already knew that it was highly acceptable to women and that it was likely to capture underserved populations because it is so accessible. So if we go to the next slide, please. So what self-sampling is that you can take a sample yourself with a little swab. You can do it in private and you can do it at the time and place of your choosing. So you can do it at home. You don't need an examination or you don't need an appointment. And how it would work is that you give a kit out to a woman, a self-sampling kit that gives them everything they need in order to do that self-sampling test and return that swab to the lab, very similarly to how we were doing with COVID testing. You can also mail the kits out directly to women. How we would do it in YouScreen is we did it in two ways. We said we'd either mail a kit to women's homes directly, or we'd offer it in GP primary care in what we call a opportunistic offer, where you come for any reason for a consultation and we see you're overdue for your screening, and so the kit would be offered. Now, the beauty of this is that you've got this flexibility of doing it at home or in the clinic, and then once you've taken your sample, you just post it directly back to the lab and you'll get your results in the post. So it's quite easy to see why self-sampling, was really, when we set out to do the trial, it was really hailed as a game changer, but we hadn't introduced it in the UK yet. It had already been introduced into other countries, and what we were really missing was the key evidence that it worked, how it worked in the UK population, by how much would you be impacting your screening uptake if you were to offer it to people who weren't coming for their screening. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the aim of YouScreen was to test those end-to-end pathways for introducing self-sampling for what we call non-attenders, so people who were at least 6 months overdue for their cervical screening. And we wanted to embed it within the NHS cervical screening program so we could really show what their impact was and to really provide the evidence base that self-sampling can improve what we call coverage in England, so how many people are coming for the screening, and that you can increase detection and treatment of high-grade cervical disease. And one of the problems that we saw in London is it's historically very, very low uptake of screening, and in some places you've got half of women who are eligible for cervical screening who aren't actually coming, so there's quite a big problem there. So we had a target population, and this is the target population in the trial, was just of those people who are eligible for screening. This is the age range, and we wanted them to be at least 6 months overdue for their screening, meaning that they hadn't responded to the invitation letter that women get in the post. The design of the trial itself was a pragmatic implementation feasibility clinical trial, and we had it set in GP primary care in 5 boroughs in North Central and North East London. So this is 133 GP practices that we included, so there's quite a big, it's quite a large trial. And also a key thing for this trial and design as well is that it was the first time that self-sampling had ever been integrated into the NHS, so that in itself has got lots of complications that come with it. Let's go to the next slide. So by the time we had got our REC application ready, we'd already been through quite a lot with setting up the trial. And one of the key things that we needed to get done was we needed Public Health England, who oversaw the cervical screening program at the time, to allow us to do the trial, i.e. allow us to embed self-sampling within their cervical screening program and have it count against, count as a screen in the program. This was really important to us to be able to get the evidence that we needed to influence a policy change. So by the time we did our REC application, we'd already had 18 months. It took us 18 months to negotiate with PHE to actually allow us to do the trial. We were completely at risk of our funding being withdrawn because, the trial hadn't started and because we didn't have the permission. So it was quite tense for us when we put our application in. Our original REC application had been with the Brighton and Sussex Committee, and this is like March 2020, so we went into our first lockdown. They cancelled the meeting because they had to prioritise COVID-19 studies. And this is the point at which our application transferred to the South Birmingham REC, which Professor Paula McGee was the chair of. Okay, so we also had to submit a CAG application for YouScreen because what we wanted to do is to be able to access women's information in the screening record to see, to ensure that they were overdue, because we wanted to accurately identify women who were overdue for their screening, and we needed to access the information which we normally wouldn't have permission to do. So that was important for us, and so we needed a CAG application, and that would allow us to identify them, write to them using a third party to post the kits out to them. We also wanted, we needed the CAG application because we wanted to use depersonalized data to access as a study team so that we could look at GP data, like get data. It would be anonymized to us, but it would be essentially the way that it works is that it would be personalized. So we still needed this CAG application for permission for that because these would be people who were not in the study, but we wanted to see who responded and who didn't in terms of the ethnicity. And we wanted to also look at their socioeconomic background. So we needed a data opt-out mechanism for this. I think that's the end of my slides, actually. So we move on to Paula.
Perfect. Thank you, Anissa. It's really great to hear how much work went into this study and already that you've had such a good experience with REC and CAG. So we're going to go over to Paula now, and Paula's going to talk to us about some of the main ethical issues that the South Birmingham REC identified. So can we go to the next slide, please?
Thank you, Anita. That was a very helpful overview of what this study was about. I think having sat on the other side of the table, as it were, in presenting my own studies for review, I very much recognise how tense and how stressful it can be. Even though you've spent months living and breathing it, it's still a big step to present it in front of a group of people who've not encountered any of this work before. I think we were very much aware of the impact of the transfer on you to a committee you'd probably never heard of, and you know, to perhaps go somewhere else when you've got yourself prepared to go to Brighton and Sussex. I have to start by saying that we thought that this was a very well prepared application. We were very, very impressed, and I think we said that in our feedback to you, that we were very impressed by the quality of the material presented. That doesn't mean to say that we didn't have any questions about it, but that the overall presentation was very good. We had two sets of questions relating to this. The first was concerning the women themselves, and we were quite unfamiliar with the idea of self-sampling, I have to say, as a committee. I don't think we'd really ever come across this subject before. And I think most of us were aware that cervical screening was very much part of the NHS programme as a whole, and that you went to the doctors and got screened. So it was quite a novel subject to consider in some respects, which RECs have to be very open to. And there were a number of factors in this study that perhaps we could have picked up on, but they were so well explained that we really didn't feel that it was necessary. However, we did want to know about certain subgroups of women who may be contacted for self-sampling. What to do if you're pregnant? Do you go ahead with it? Should you leave it till later? What about women who had never had sexual intercourse and were virgins? What should be said to them? And then, given the nature of the population, what we knew about the 5 areas of London, we knew that there would likely be a very wide ethnic mix, and that some of those women would have undergone female genital mutilation, which, as sure many of you are aware, is quite disfiguring to female genitalia, and for whom penetration of any sort can be very, very painful. So how are these topics going to be addressed within the context of gathering data for this study? An additional factor, which I'm afraid isn't on the slide, but is the issue of safeguarding. And I think this sort of was something that really the applying team hadn't really considered, that maybe some of the women who did provide samples there might be something in the test to show that they had some evidence of abuse or some other factor that gave cause for concern about their safety. And that would apply also maybe to the victims of genital mutilation. as well. We had a very long discussion about those issues, and decided that these were topics that we should raise with the application, with the applicant. The second one, because we had not come across this before, I think, we asked about the procedures of the test itself. How accurate was it? The application did give information about this, but we wanted to hear what Anita and her colleagues actually had to say about this test. Was it accurate? And there were some additional concerns about, well, if this becomes the norm, if this test takes place and becomes the norm, would it stop women going to the clinic to have their samples taken? And how would that impact on the nature of the service and the need for it? And then there were issues around, well, what's going to happen to the samples? This was the time of COVID. So how were these samples to be returned? I'm sure we can all remember the red letter boxes with priority stamped on them. How is this actually going to work so that they got back to the team in a reasonable amount of time? And finally, were the GPs on board with this? The entry gate was really through GP practices to identify women who had either not been screened or who had not turned up for screening, and had missed their last appointment. So were the GPs actually on board with this? Because anything that you do in the GP practice automatically impacts on the rest of the work. Whose job was it going to be? How is it going to be managed? That the women were identified so that they could be given information about the procedure when they came perhaps for some other reasons, such as a chest infection or something like that. So there was quite a few things that we wanted to ask about. And I'm pleased to say that Anita did answer them very well. So our decision at the end was that it should be favourable, but that there, could I have the next slide, please? It should be a favourable. We didn't have a problem. We didn't have a problem with not seeking formal consent in writing, because for so many of the people concerned, there may be issues around literacy, there may be issues around being fearful of signing anything because of what had happened to them previously or what they feared might happen to them. We didn't really see a problem with accessing the details of the women, their names, addresses, and so on. It wasn't for the team to do that. It was going to be done within the confines of the surgery, so they would not necessarily know, they wouldn't know who these people were. But we felt that there should be information on the website that accompanied the application about safeguarding and sources of help and advice if necessary. We felt that the information sheet of participants was good, but it was just a little bit woolly about what was going to happen to the samples long term. The information sheet said that the samples would be stored for future research, and there were queries from several of the members of, well, what sort of research? So that we asked for some extra some clarification that it would be research relating to the tests themselves, and to make absolutely clear that the study was research and wasn't linked to treatment in any way. Whereas if you went to a clinic at that stage and had a test, it would be followed up by treatment. And finally, we asked as a recommendation that the team look at women who have had like female genital mutilation and add this to the study information so that they were aware of how best to move forward with that. Thank you. move back to Anita now, please.
Thanks, Paula. So that's some quite meaty issues there. Anita, how did you respond to those?
So should we take it piece by piece? Can we go back and then I'll remind myself of what the things were, because some of them were more important than others. So uh, uh, things around the pregnancy and virgins, that was something that we had, I think we probably already had a good answer to, because this is something that comes up quite a lot with cell sampling, what do you do if you're pregnant? And we had good answers for that, because basically one of the issues that we do see is that women get pregnant, they miss their screen and they don't come, and then sometimes you see them turning up with some abnormalities because they've had quite a delay. So there's nothing wrong with cell sampling during pregnancy. There's no clinical reason as to why not. I think we might have taken a stance as to saying that actually, just because we wanted to be quite conservative, given it was, we want to be more belts and braces, so there's nothing wrong with doing it, but we would say, okay, maybe you don't for this clinical study, but there's nothing wrong with doing it. There's no clinical reason why not. And in terms of the victims of female genital mutilation, this is a piece that I think was really, really helpful for us as a research team. So we hadn't thought this feeds into the safeguarding element as well. So the answer in terms of FGM, people who've suffered with FGM, is that it's much easier to get a swab in than it's going to be to get a speculum in. And so we thought that self sampling would actually be a really, really good for this population. So that I think that closed the question off, I say, really well. But to come and touch on the safeguarding aspect, because of what the REC said, we hadn't thought about it, and we thought, okay, so let's go and reach out to the CCG NHS leads on safeguarding. So we had quite a few conversations actually about it with the safeguarding lead, and we also had we went and did a bit of a little survey with the GP practices that we knew, with nurses and GPs. We just asked them questions, what safeguarding issues do come up during cervical screening. And that was really, really interesting because some people fed back, yes, we do actually see sometimes disclosure of domestic abuse, or you might notice something, but the bottom line was that we do. And sometimes we pick up other things. We use cervical screening for other things, and we'd be concerned if you weren't seeing these women because maybe you're missing opportunities. But given, what hangs on self-sampling in underscreened women is that those women are at highest risk of developing cervical cancer. So in the big picture of things, you might miss out on some disclosure of things, but these women actually are really high risk of being developing cervical cancer. It'd be better in the bigger picture that the risks don't outweigh the benefits. The benefit was bigger there, that if you can get more women screened who aren't currently protected, then they'll take the hit. And that was really interesting for us to hear from the GP practices about what they are seeing in these visits, and therefore thinking, what do we think about implementation, and what we might want to think about more carefully in terms of how we educate when we do the site initiation, like how we handle FAQs and what we would put in place, any safeguards we put in place. So the key things that we did is we had we'd set up a helpline already with Joe Cervical Cancer Trust to field any questions for women who had questions about self-sampling for the trial. And so we had them link in, we had them trained actually, and then we also had them do a DBS check. So all off the back of this REC question, we had them trained. They knew exactly who to signpost to if any issues did come up. And we also changed the information that was available on our microsite and in the patient information leaflet. The advice from the safeguarding experts within the NHS and the CCGs were to say, well, don't call it out too much because you don't want to exclude people who might have other questions. So we recommend, please just, list a few things that you might want to go and ask questions about, and then give the number without being too explicit about it. So that's what we did in our response to the REC committee, and I think they were pretty happy with that. And other ways in which thinking about the test itself and the accuracy, this really helped us start to articulate that, because it was quite a very difficult thing to articulate. What are you saying about it? And also it helped us bring that clarity of what are we saying to people, like what does it mean? Because if you give a quantitative number, it's quite hard for people to conceptualize. But what the key thing here is that it's most important that you come, whichever way, a choice. You can still have your conventional screening test if you want to, but if you're not coming and you don't come, then this is the very, very, a very good option, because if you're not screened, that's what you're looking at. That's the worst, the worst kind of outcome for us is that you can't be protected from cervical cancer if you're not screened. So it helped us to think about how we position that in the patient information leaflet, what we're saying in the consent form. And we already had good experience with the GP practices just because we've done a lot of these. We'd already done quite a lot of research and self-sampling, all in GP primary care. And we already knew what the appetite was. We knew that there'd be a strong interest there. So we were quite well prepared for that question. And then the other thing that this raises is the fact that this just came during the first lockdown, because suddenly everyone was remote, including the GP practices. Everyone was working remotely. Their whole workload had changed. The way that they were working was very, very different. So we had to keep on adapting to how they were working, and they were under a lot of pressure. So we had to work a lot with them. So one of the things that Paula mentioned was thinking about, well, how are you making sure that people are coming back for a follow-up test? And that question from the REC helped us build in a mechanism that we worked with the GP practices for that acted as a safety net. So it was an electronic way of making sure that if anyone did come up with an abnormal result on their self-sampling result, that the system could remind the staff who were already under a lot of pressure because of COVID, so that we didn't miss, gave us that chance to make sure that people didn't get missed when they did have a positive result. So that was another good thing coming from the REC review. And I did want to just touch on what Paula said about the implicit consent, because I'd worked in clinical trials for quite a while, and at this before I started doing the self-sampling stuff, and what we'd always thought that REC committees wanted to see was written informed consent with initials in every box. And when you come to do these sort of pragmatic trials where you've got it in clinical practice, GPs are busy. You're not going to get good recruitment if they have to sit there and do the initials in the box. So if you can avoid it, and it feeds into your research question, it helps you answer the question, then that would be preferable. But we'd never gone for implicit consent before until the Brighton and Sussex REC, who we'd had a different self-sampling study with. They're the ones that said to us, why are you asking for written consent? And we said, well, because we thought you'd want to see that. And they said, no, you're making it really hard for yourself. This is screening. They're either going to return the sample. It's implicit. If they don't want to take part in the study, they're not going to return that sample. And so you can take it like that. And that was a really, really helpful thing for us as researchers that we've built into the rest of our studies, just because you've got precedent there. And, it's a really nice way that we were working together with the REC in that way to help our study be a lot more robust, more practicable, etc.
Great, thank you. So this has been touched on. I'd really like to ask both of you, really. Obviously, the context of COVID was quite significant. Paula, do you think that impacted the kinds of questions you asked? Do you think if you were reviewing this study now, say a brand new application, do you think you would ask the same questions and you'd raise the same issues? Do you think it made you a bit more cautious about things like the test and the GP practices? And the same to Anita, really, how much did that change how you ran the study at that time? If you could do it again, do you think you would do things differently without the COVID context?
I think maybe if Anita goes first, it would be easier to answer the question.
I mean, COVID, we had so many challenges in YouScreen, and, really shout out to my research team because they bossed the whole lot. We did it together. But this, coming back to what we were in, this is like, I think the REC meeting that we had was one of the first online meetings that you had ever had and that we'd ever had. So you're kind of coming to this environment. But, COVID was it did allow us as well, there's opportunity there, as people would always say. And we would have been facing 133 site initiation visits to do. And because of COVID, and we were like, oh, we're all online now. So actually, why don't we just do them as a webinar, which we wouldn't have thought about. I don't know if other people do this, but we hadn't thought about that before. We'd never done a study of that scale, actually, like where you're really, GP practices, they're all busy. You need the engagement or you're never going to get the recruitment. How do you do this effectively at scale? And COVID was one thing that allowed us to do things at scale. But having said that, there were huge challenges. We had to keep on redesigning the study because we'd envisaged everything we'd planned was for the idea that everyone can go to the GP practice, but now they're doing telephone consultations. Now, there was a lot of stuff that was going on that we had to keep on evolving. But this is almost why I say as well that this study really changed me, because we had to keep on reacting and changing things and adapting to make it work and to really support the GP practice as well, because they had a very difficult time with COVID. And so for them to do this trial, I mean, I'm really, really pleased that they did this, because they could have easily said, no, this wasn't part of COVID. We kind of convinced the REC that we could, that it could help with COVID, but it really wasn't part of their core work. And so, yeah, I think we're really grateful to everyone for being able to come along with us on this.
I think from the REC point of view, this was still the early days of lockdown, and suddenly RECs were plunged into, you've got to have a meeting, you've got to have meetings on Zoom. And this took quite a lot of adjustment one way or the other. It was a period that highlighted problems with connectivity and how to actually conduct a meeting without any forewarning. To conduct a meeting, it's quite different when you are in a room with other people and you can go around the table and you can have cross-table discussion. And we were learning very rapidly that this was quite difficult on Zoom, because you had to be able to have this to allow every member to have their say, but also to facilitate discussion without people talking over one another. I think that was quite a challenge to begin with, to actually structure the discussion, well, not prescribe the discussion, but to actually have a healthy discussion where everybody got the opportunity to say what they thought and what they wanted, that what they felt ought to be raised. I think if we were to do it now, if we were to review a project, this application now, I don't think our questions would change. But perhaps we might have broadened it out a little bit in terms of asking a little bit more about the test itself, or maybe having a little bit more discussion about issues around things like safeguarding, which we did bring up, but I think we may have gone into perhaps a little bit more detail with that. And I think I don't think the full scale of change in GP practices was emergent, and now we'd want to be asking questions about, well, how are these GP practices going to be part of this? What are they actually? How are they actually structured? When so much of practice is about telephone calls and perhaps hiving off things into other spheres. How is it actually going to work now in terms of what these GP practices are working into, and what dialogue are you having with them to ensure that as things continually change, and they do seem to be changing all the time, how are you going to accommodate that as you move forward? I think one of the big things that's really emerged since this study was reviewed was the realization of the neglect of women's health and the lack of research into women's health issues. And whilst I don't want to go into detail about that, I think we would have perhaps had a bit more discussion about that, partly because it's featured in the news, it's featured in so many other places. It's much more, people are much more aware of it now, whereas perhaps it wasn't quite so much reported on as it is now. I think those are things that we would be considering in a bit more detail now.
Thank you, Paula. So coming back to the kind of the women's, obviously big theme of the study, the women's health element. Anita, out of your sample, how many of those women were pregnant or virgins or victims of FGM? Did that kind of materialise in practice, those issues that the REC had raised with you?
Because of the nature of GP records, like, because our data, we didn't ask specifically, are you a virgin, are you pregnant? It's very difficult to know from the sample because that data is not collected cleanly from GP practice, but nor did we, collect it. But so what I would be relying on here is anecdotal report from the GP practices. And what we did find, we always get the virgin cases, but I couldn't quantify how many. But obviously they're of lower risk because of the sexual contact is not there. But we certainly had anecdotal reports from the GP practices who were really pleased to be able to offer self-sampling to women who they'd not seen coming in for their screening because of multiple things, some of them being sexual abuse or violence, and FGM for sure, or any, all these other types of people that they just weren't able to get screened before, like people with learning disabilities and people who have got like chaotic lifestyles, and they just screening's just not on their mind. They were able to pick them up by offering a self-sample, because it's kind of a different proposition. You can just quickly do it in clinic when you're with them. So no numbers, but certainly, we did start to see some of these. We heard stories about these, which was really pleasing for us as a study team to know that, that if, populations who have been maybe not able to access the standard screening test, were actually being captured by self-sampling.
Thank you. And Will, if we just go forward to the next slide again, please. The advice that you were asked to seek on the best guidance for women who have experienced FGM, adding that to the study information, did you feel that that was something that you learned a lot from? Have you taken that forward into other work that you've done?
I would say that we did learn from it. We learned not so much of obviously Anita presented what she was going to do about it and so on. But I think it was something that really made people think about this issue. It wasn't something that we had actually come across in terms of the applications we received. And therefore it was a learning experience to think, well, these are subjects that we need to be aware of for the future. If we have further applications or that concern women's health generally, but also things to do with sexuality and sexual health. So I think that was really important that we brought that up. And I think it's something that perhaps nowadays we would spend a bit more time on, because again, it's something that's made much more aware certainly in the professional journals, and to some extent in the mainstream news occasionally, that this is something that's going on. And whilst the mainstream news doesn't necessarily report on the details of it, it does now make reference to it. So I think it's important that committees are open to thinking about these things, and to also thinking what other things do we need to be aware of in applications concerning women's health in the future. I think that's probably where we would go with what to go with that. I think safeguarding is certainly an increasingly important issue at the moment these days. Perhaps a lot more than it has a much higher profile than it did back in 2020 in terms of the reports about not just women's health, but women's safety, women's well-being. And I think there is much more awareness now of the need to have safeguarding procedures in place, or both organisationally and in terms of the research procedures that researchers are planning to perform. So I think that is a big area of change over the last few years.
Thank you, Paula. You kind of touched a bit there on what was going to be my next question for you, actually. Obviously, we've heard about Anita saying that she's learned a lot from the process and this REC review as a researcher and for the study, but what do you think the biggest lesson was for you and for the REC from reviewing this study?
Biggest lesson? I think it's about being open. I'm not saying that we were in any way close to innovation, but I think at the time that we did this, it was being open to different ways of doing things. We didn't have people signing for reasons that I've already touched on. We didn't see that there was a problem here, but maybe other RECs might take a different view. A REC's opinion is based on that group of people on the day that they looked at a particular application. But I think it emphasized the need for openness, the need to, and actually the excitement of seeing something novel, something different, really, that really sparked engagement, I think, from members. We had not had an application of this sort before. We were flagged for certain other issues, which meant that we got a number of applications relating to psychology, relating to children, relating to medical devices. So this was actually a bit of a change for us, and a most interesting one as well. So it was good to be able to be part of this. And when we saw the results published, we were very pleased to see receive publication about this, and to actually see it reported in the mainstream news. And to actually see that, I think it gave some years down the line, it gave committee members a bit of a boost. We played a part in this, and I think that feedback loop was actually very helpful, because we don't always hear what happens to individual projects, and sometimes they don't finish, or sometimes they just we don't hear about what happened, what was the outcome, unless we make a point of seeing if anything was published as a result afterwards.
Obviously, we're talking about REC review now, but Anita, obviously the study went to CAG as well. Is there anything interesting that you'd like to tell us about what the CAG asked you and how that review went?
Let me think about it. So the CAG review was quite interesting, because we hadn't. I think maybe we'd not done one before. Maybe I did one years ago, but that process changed quite a lot since I'd done it. So it was interesting to understand what they were looking for, but they're quite different from the REC, I thought. But they were interested in our data, which was very, very complex. And what the CAG review helped us do was really clarify what on earth we were doing with the data and what the data was that we were collecting. And anyone who's looked at our application will know, who knows what's going on with that data. But what they asked us to do, they not forced us, but they because we could see that it wasn't clear, that we had to do this whole data flows thing, which helped us have clarity on like who's receiving the data, when, what, how, and therefore who's the controller, and make it really, really visible and easy for people to understand. So they really helped us with that, and we're really grateful for the CAG review, actually, because we needed this data enabled to get the evidence, and the evidence obviously underpinned this policy changes you've alluded to, but it was because of the data that we had very good data, and we wouldn't have had the data if we didn't get the CAG, and we wouldn't have been able to identify women accurately if we didn't have the CAG. So they could see the clinical benefit, they could see what the rationale there was, but they wanted us to clarify things and also provide an opt-out mechanism. They were very big on PPI. They wanted us to have really robust PPI to really understand that if we're going to give you this Section 251, we need to know that people actually would be okay with this, that they would want their data to be shared. So that was, I'd have to say, it was a tough exercise, because it was, we had to really, really, look at it and think about it really, really carefully. But it was, ultimately a helpful one.
And Paula, do you remember anything that the REC asked about PPI from a REC perspective?
Well, I think the things that we asked about were reflected in the conditions that we made. That there were just there was particular issues in it that just weren't quite clear, about, for example, retaining samples, and making absolutely clear that this was research. And I'm not suggesting it just needed to be spelt out a little bit more clearly, because the women may have thought that this was going to the clinic, and not always appreciated it. It's very easy, I think, to overlook how people construe words like research, and indeed things like confidentiality. That what we think is absolutely clear is not necessarily clear to those people who are actually likely to be participants. So I think one of the things that certainly we made a point of doing for any application was scrutinizing the information sheet to make sure that it was clear. Really from the point of view, well, if I was a potential participant, would I wish to take part on the basis of what's being said here. And I have to say that in this instance, the majority of it was clear and it was very well written, apart from these points that we'd identified. But it isn't always the case. And I think there's still a lot of work that researchers need to do in a more general sense in trying to explain carefully and clearly what you're doing or what they're planning to do. I think it's Schrödinger who says that if at the end of the day you can't tell people what you're doing, then you've wasted your time, or words to that effect. And that's very much the case with information sheets, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Paula. There are lots more questions I'd like to ask about this, but I am conscious of the time. So shall we move on now to the next slide for Paula to tell us about the impact that the study has had now?
I think it's my slide. I think it's my slide actually, Paula. Yeah. So that's all right. We'll move on to the next slide, please. As we've already mentioned earlier on in the talk, that YouScreen has had a really big impact, and it's had specifically the one that we had set out to do. So the results from the study were used to inform a policy change along with other data, and the UK National Screening Committee, who make the decisions on and recommendations on all screening in the UK, has just this year they recommended that HPV self-sampling could be provided as an option for under-screened women in the cervical screening program, which was a massive win. Obviously, there was lots of pickup from media at the time. And the other good piece of news as well is that DHSC announced that they would be rolling out self-sampling across England. I think they said by 2026 that we could expect to see that rolled out, which is amazing because it's exactly what we wanted to happen, that we start seeing it in practice. If we go to the next slide. This is just to give you a bit of a flavour on what the participant feedback was. So we did get some people who were very excited to receive their self-sampling kit. But the next slide is where I think we can really see the impact hit home. If we just go to the next one. So this is what, to me, is the most important pieces. This is quotes from women who were in the YouScreen trial who reached out either of their own, accord independently or feedback through the GP practice. So on the left here, we've got someone who reported that they were so happy to do their self-sample because they've found smear tests so difficult. So this is exactly the target population. This is the impact that you can have on patients, that you can make something much easier for them and much more acceptable. And the second one here is one that I find on a personal level extremely rewarding, that this is someone who came from a history of sexual abuse as a child. And she had written to me saying that she really wanted to self-sample because she didn't want anyone to touch her, but she was very scared of developing cervical cancer, but she couldn't, go through the standard test. She wasn't keen on doing that. And, at the time I had to tell her that I'm sorry that you can't because you've got to be on the trial and you don't live in the area. But when DHC made the announcement and UK NSC made the announcement that now we're going to introduce and roll it out across the NHS, I wrote back to her and told her that, she should be able to get a self-sample very soon. And she was so happy. And this is the response that she gave me. And this is sort of, to me, at the end of the day, this is what we are all trying to do. That this is important to me, that you want to have that patient impact at that level. So I was really pleased to receive that email.
I think it's really interesting, very moving to read that last one in particular, isn't it? I think when we look at the impact of this study, it really reflects how the pandemic generated new approaches, new ways of doing things. Things didn't have to carry on as they were. The existing service of going to the GP practice and having your smear test done there, it wasn't working for a good many women, and it could not work for a good many women because of accessibility problems, perhaps history of sexual abuse, rape, or simply feeling unable for whatever reason to have it done, or simply thinking, well, they don't actually. I know from some little bit of work that I did a few years ago that one of the things that we found in that was that women preferred to go back home to the country that they'd originated in, women from Poland were going back to Poland to have it done, and not have it done here because they knew the doctors and they felt confident in the process and the procedure there. So it's really terrific to see that despite the suffering of the pandemic, that we actually had positive things come out of it, in terms of enabling more women to get screened for the possibility of cervical cancer.
Thank you both. I mean, obviously it's an amazing study. It sounds like it has really changed how patients will experience cervical screening going forward. Before we go into the Q&A, I would just like to ask Anita, what do you think the practical challenges are going to be of rolling out self-sampling on a national scale?
We've given them a good blueprint because this is actually part of the reason why we did the study. We actually changed all the clinical pathway at the digital level within the NHS. So that's why it was such a huge study to do. But I think they'll have challenges with, it is always really challenging to get new things into treatment because it'll be operational stuff, basically where you've got how are you going to distribute the kits like at that scale. But I think that'll be the key thing probably. And then also how it's communicated. Like it has to be, we communicated it very carefully for the trial because, we were, when you've got that lens on it, you're very microscopic about how you do things. And we wanted to be accurate. And it's not saying that the program wouldn't be accurate, but how do you convey that messaging of like, who should come for it? What's the choice here? And everything. How are you doing results? So I think those would be. It's a practical things that I think that they'll have a challenge with, and then you've got to go and get it into practice so that convince GP practices that they can do it and that it won't take time, and how you're going to retrain them. But having said that, we've got. This is the point of YouScreen as well, that we've already given them that full clinical path. They can take the learnings from it, and there's obviously improvements to be done, but it's just about feeding that into the whole system, the end-to-end pathway. How do you make that operational at a large scale?
I think there are still, though, perhaps certain groups of women who will still be perhaps not so easy to engage with. Women who lack an address, women who are homeless, women who are moving between B&Bs and so on, and women who are on the streets, women who live on the streets. And there may be other considerations as to how we reach out to those women, and possibly through other services that are already out there, so that we mustn't think, right, we've cracked it. There's still more to do. But I think I say that from a positive point of view because I think we have cracked it to a great extent, but there's still a bit more to consider there.
Amazing, thank you. So we've got some questions popping up. So I'm just going to start asking some of those. So we have Anita. How did you avoid the issue of women feeling that they were being told off for not coming for conventional screening in the participant information?
We very carefully worded all of the patient information, so the invitation letter, and the patient information leaflet, and even the instructions for how to take it. We took a very, very positively framed. Like the wording was very positive. We weren't saying, "Oh, you're late," whatever. We made it more about kind of like, did you know that if you're not screened that you're at highest risk? So it was more about like those facts, but not saying, "Oh, you haven't come and it's a bad thing." It's more kind of like, "Oh, this is how you can get protected, and here's an opportunity for you." So it's more using that sort of language. But of course, you don't want to be saying, "Oh, telling you off because you're not looking after your health," or anything like that. So it was very, very carefully worded, our whole package, I think.
Thank you. And one for Paula, from a member of another REC. This member said they found the point that Anita made about taking a recommendation from another REC to adapt the consent process fascinating, and a really great example of how RECs can enable pragmatic approaches to clinical trial design and recruitment. Were there any guidance or tools that help support the REC to approve that pragmatic approach to informed consent?
Um, well, if there were, we were not aware of them. I have to say, we felt that we didn't actually. But there were enough of us in the room who were experienced researchers who could say, well, look, there are from my own work times when gaining written consent, the standard way of doing things, just doesn't work. For example, I've worked on the streets doing research with people who are homeless. Nobody is going to sign anything if you do that kind of work. And there are others who, for one reason or another, cannot or do not wish to go through those formal procedures. And RECs have to be open to that, because otherwise we're not being inclusive. We are shutting people out. If people cannot read, one of the things I have felt very strongly about over the years is this insistence on having written information sheets when a large number of people in this country are functionally or totally illiterate. And that's not because they don't speak English, it's because, for one reason or another, they just cannot read and write at all, because they're dyslexic or because they didn't, for whatever reason. And so I think we have to think carefully about how inclusive is the sample actually being when we review any application. And think about, well, does it have to be this way in this instance? Can we find a different way of communicating with people?
Okay, if I comment on this as well, Kirsty, because this is something that if you take away anything from this meeting, this is one key thing that I would like the people, who are watching to take away, is that this pragmatic approach from the REC, and Paula, actually the stuff that we didn't actually get into, where Paula had a chat with us before the REC meeting because we were quite nervous about it. But this pragmatic approach was so key to getting this trial done. And I don't know if it would have happened if we'd encountered a committee who were like, oh, we can't do this and that, because we wouldn't have gotten the data. We wouldn't have gotten the results we needed. So, having, as a researcher who's done so much pragmatic research, it's just so important that you keep that open mind, and look at precedent as well, and think openly, as Paula said.
And obviously, Paula, you've touched there on inclusivity, and a big part of our new strategy is about increasing diversity of people taking part in research. So if we just finish with two kind of questions here that are along that theme, but they're two different sides of the same thing. So we've got a question: is there a risk that self-screening options will reduce availability of traditional screening methods? What would this mean for women who can't self-sample, so those with physical disabilities? And then kind of the flip side as well, some people, of course, don't identify as a woman but still need to attend cervical screening, and how could home screening benefit them, or does it not benefit them?
Well, I think first of all, the business of women who can't, for whatever reason, self-screening. Nobody, I don't think either of us is suggesting, either Anita or myself this evening, that self-screening is going to cut out all the options. It's not self-screening or no screening. It is simply an option for a number of women who, for whatever reason, cannot go to a clinic or do not wish to go to a clinic, and would prefer to do this themselves. And there can be multiple reasons for that. It's not going to stop women who are unable to do self-screening. Perhaps people who have had problems with their hands, who have had an amputation, perhaps, who would find it very difficult to do it themselves. There is absolutely nothing stopping it. Nobody is ever suggesting that they cannot go to the GP and say, can you do a cervical screen for me? So I think that was the important thing from that one. The second question, could you repeat that, please?
The second one was about people who don't identify as women but still need cervical screening, and how home screening would impact them.
Well, I don't see that it should be any different for them. If they are on record as having a cervix, then they should be able to have self-screening. I don't see any problem with that in any way. It's actually a fairly won't say unaddressed, but an issue that perhaps hasn't had that much attention. And I don't know whether Anita's sample actually included any women in this category. But it may not be possible to answer that question.
We certainly had one trans man who took part in the study. We know that, which was quite exciting for us. I know it's an N of 1, but it was still really exciting that we're still able to do that. And there's actually quite a big body of research going on in the trans population for self-sampling that Alison Byrne is leading on, because self-sampling is viewed as a more acceptable form of screening for people who don't identify as women, and just looking into the ins and outs of that and how, say, taking hormone treatment, for example, would change your accuracy of the test. So that's an active area of research and something I think we're going to see more of, and as we mentioned before, really this is just the beginning for self-sampling, and it is an option. You're just adding to your options, and there should always be the choice to have, in the foreseeable future, to have that clinician sample if you wanted it.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you all so much for the questions that you've submitted and the discussion that we've just had. Unfortunately, we have now run out of time, so we are at the end of our session today. So before I draw the session to a close, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Anita and Paula for joining us today and for sharing all of their insights into the YouScreen study with us. And a huge thank you, of course, as well to everyone who has joined us today to listen to this discussion. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a feedback form that's open that you can access either by scanning that QR code that's now on the screen, or you will be sent a link to your emails as well. Please do let us know what you think, because we would love to hear your thoughts and how we could improve any future events that we might run in this series. So thank you so much. Please look out for information on any future sessions coming soon, and I hope you'll have a lovely evening. Thank you again.
Thank you.